Okay, so we're going to continue talking about cognitive development across the lifespan. And the second video on cognitive development is going to focus on Jean Piaget. And as it says in some of the other slides, Jean Piaget was a Swiss psychologist who had a job early in his career of testing Parisian school children. And in doing so, he was just testing them to sort them into educational tracks. But as he did so, he noticed that children of specific ages, even children who were very different from each other intellectually, still made reliable errors at specific ages. And he became interested in the idea that regardless of our intelligence, that we may show cognitive development in fairly reliable stages with limits on what we can do in one stage before we move on to the next, and that those stages are mostly age or brain maturation driven. And so we're going to look at those stages, but before we do that, there's just some basic ideas about Piaget that I hope you remember from looking at the static slides, or that you'll look at the static slides and familiarize yourself with more. And the first is that Piaget is very interested in the idea of schemas, and schemas essentially are ways of understanding the world. And so, in adulthood, we tend to pay a little bit less attention to the schemas we have, but we have those schemas. And so these are, beliefs from you about how the world works. So, a schema might be that if you live your life well, you'll be rewarded in the end, might be a schema. It's easier to see schemas and especially see errors in schemas when we look at young children, because often the way they understand the world, it seems so obviously wrong to us that we're really become aware of their kind of cognitive process. And so a small child might have a schema for what a dog is. A dog is furry and has 4 legs and a tail and pointy ears and comes up, if you're a small child, comes up to, my chest or something like that. And then they encounter a Great Dane and they perhaps don't know what to do with that Great Dane. In terms of understanding him, and they may think that the Great Dane in fact fits their schema of a pony, if a pony is something with 4 legs and short hair and is taller than me. And so if that's your schema, you're going to get it wrong, right? Because your schema isn't going to account for all the different varieties of dogs that might happen. And so children often have the experience of having to adjust their schemas. And Piaget talked about what happens when we encounter information that doesn't fit our schemas, that we can do one of two things. We can either decide that, in fact, our schema is right and whatever contradictory information we're getting is wrong, and we keep our schema and decide we were right, and that is called assimilation, that we just bring the new information into our existing schema and continue on our merry way. But often we come across information that we can't just say, I'm sure I'm right, that we have to accommodate or change our schema and to bring in this new information. And so the child who is convinced, he hears the Great Dane bark, other people are calling it a dog, it's playing like a dog, and the child has to accommodate his schema to say, okay, so I guess dogs can be bigger, and I need to have a broader definition of dog that fits this dog as well as my beagle that I'm familiar with at home, right? And so we have accommodation and assimilation. And when we accommodate in broad ways, that's when we move from one stage to another. And so I'm going to have you watch some videos about the 4 stages that you see down here. They'll be in the course material, and there's slides that describe these. So I'm just going to do a quick overview, but you have more specific information, and then we will talk more about these together in the discussion as well. But the sensory motor stage, right, happens in infancy, you can see here, and it is focused on sensation, right? So our 5 senses and motor movement or muscle movement. So this schemas here are about the physical experience of things. And so an infant, you're given an infinite set of keys, and they're going to explore the keys by banging them, by tasting them, by throwing them. And they really understand the world by what I can physically do with this thing. That is where the schemas are. And one basic idea here that the slides talk about more is that this is a stage where we develop something called object permanence. And that is, again, right, about the physical world. And it is very basically a schema that says that things continue to exist even if I can't see them. And children don't fully develop that idea until they're almost 2 years old. And they develop it gradually with little pieces of it, but they gradually develop this idea that things continue to exist. And before they have that schema, they really do think that things don't exist unless I can see them. That's a very basic schema that then has to get accommodated or changed as they find that that's not true. But by age 2, they know even if things aren't visible to me, they continue to exist. They don't disappear from existence. And then once they have that in place, then they can think a little bit more in terms of symbols, in terms of things that aren't right in front of them. And they move to the pre-operational stage, which is in early childhood, ages 2 to 6 or so for Piaget. And in the pre-operational stage, we're really going to define the child's schemas and understanding of the world by what they can't do now, but they will be able to do on the concrete operational stage. And you have videos that I'm going to ask you to watch that we can talk about together that show children who are unable to use logic and unable to hang on to more than one aspect of a situation at a time, but then will be able to do that in the concrete operational stage. And the most basic test of this is something called conservation of volume. And we have lots of different conservation experiments. You'll see those in the video, several of them. The conservation of volume is the one where they have 2 identical glasses full of water. They pour one while the child watches into a shorter, wider glass, and then ask the child if the glasses are the same or if one has more. And children who are pre-operational are always going to say that the shorter one has less, that the taller one has more, even though they watched you pour the identical fluid into the new container. Whereas concrete operational children will see the logic of that it must be the same. They will be able to account for the width and the height at the same time, and they'll be able to tell you, no, it's the same water, it's the same amount of water. But the ability to move from the lack of logic to the presence of logic is really about an accommodation, again, a change in how we understand the world. And formal operations, which doesn't happen until adolescence, is about the ability to think abstractly. And so again, there's a video that I'll ask you to watch there. But the ability to think abstractly is the ability to think about hypotheticals, the ability to imagine worlds that don't actually exist, the ability to imagine something you've never directly experienced or even perhaps had somebody describe to you, that you could just imagine something brand new. And this allows you to do advanced science. You can't do physics, for example, theoretical physics at least, without having formal operations. It's really hard without formal operations to actively think about philosophy, which is very abstract, right? And so all of that becomes really hard. Even thinking about psychology in some ways, that would be really hard to teach a 5th grader many of the psychological concepts that you've understood. So do look at the slides specifically in detail, like they talk about these in detail, and watch those videos, and we'll spend a fair amount of our discussion talking about Piaget and making sure you get those concepts. Okay?